He lived in a quiet street where life moved slowly, and everyone seemed to know each other, yet no one truly knew him. His house was old, built long before most of the homes in the neighborhood. Its paint was faded and the wooden shutters creaked when the wind blew. Inside it smelled faintly of aged paper, dust, and memories. Shelves were lined with books that had yellowed with time, and letters tied with ribbon sat in stacks on a side table. He had lived alone for decades, a man whose life had become a collection of routines, small acts, and quiet thoughts. When neighbors asked him about his past, he would sometimes joke that he hadn't touched a woman since 1760. It was a hyperbole, of course, but it captured the truth in a way that was both funny and sad. He had distanced himself from human connection for so long that it seemed impossible to reach him. He rose every morning at the same time. Before the sun had fully stretched across the sky, he brewed his tea, strong and dark, and sat by the window to watch the world wake. Children walked to school with backpacks bouncing on their shoulders, and neighbors emerged from their homes chatting softly or tending to their gardens. He observed them quietly, never intruding, never asking, never joining. He found comfort in watching life from a distance. There was a rhythm in his isolation, a pattern that made each day predictable and safe. His mornings were followed by walks in the nearby park. He moved slowly, leaning on a cane, his eyes scanning the surroundings with careful attention. He knew the trees, the benches, the cracks in the path where flowers stubbornly grew. He recognized the regulars, the elderly man who fed pigeons, the mother with a stroller, the teenager on rollerblades who always waved at the same time every morning. He never spoke to them beyond a nod or a polite smile. Conversation felt foreign, unnecessary, and in some way dangerous. It had been too long since he had allowed himself to be vulnerable, and he had grown protective of the solitude that now defined him. Inside, his house was a shrine to memory. Photographs of people long gone adorned the walls. Some were family members, some were friends whose names he could barely recall. There were snapshots of moments that mattered, yet the details were blurred by time. He rarely touched these photographs. He preferred the memory of them in his mind, untouched by the risk of sorrow or regret. He had learned to carry the past quietly within him, never letting it spill over into the present. It was easier this way. Easier to live without expectation, without disappointment, and without the complicated mess of human emotion. He had a small garden out back, though it was more for form than function. A few roses bloomed every year, stubborn against neglect. He watered them occasionally, more out of routine than love, and sometimes paused to admire the soft pink petals. He understood beauty. He always had, but he kept a careful distance from it. Beauty reminded him of what life could offer, and what he had refused for so long. Touching it, tending it with care, might awaken feelings he had spent decades suppressing, and he was not ready for that. Neighbors whispered about him from time to time. They found his quiet demeanor strange, his old-fashioned manners peculiar. Some said he was lonely. Others assumed he was bitter. Children found him intimidating, though they were curious. They peeked through the fence to see if he was outside, hoping for a glimpse of something unusual. Occasionally he would wave, a slow, deliberate gesture that startled them more than it comforted. Yet despite the speculation, no one truly knew the man who lived behind the faded shutters and the wooden gate. He spent much of his time reading. Books were his companions, his teachers, his friends. History fascinated him. He could lose himself for hours in the lives of people long gone. He studied their triumphs and mistakes, their love and loss, and he found comfort in knowing that the human experience had always been full of joy and sorrow, regardless of time or place. Fiction offered a different kind of escape, allowing him to walk in someone else's shoes, feel emotions he had long since buried, and imagine a world beyond the walls of his quiet house. Reading was safe. It did not demand, it did not judge, and it did not hurt. Occasionally he would write letters, though they were never sent. They were addressed to people from his past, to moments that had left a mark on him, to feelings he could not voice aloud. The letters were carefully penned, the words deliberate, the emotions hidden between the lines. Writing was his way of connecting with the world without risking rejection or pain. Each letter was a small testament to the life he had lived and the emotions he still carried. They were private, intimate, and sacred. Meals were simple and quiet. He rarely cooked anything elaborate, preferring the safety of familiar flavors and easy preparation. Breakfast was always tea and toast. Lunch was often a sandwich eaten slowly while sitting by the window. Dinner was usually a small plate of vegetables and meat. Nothing that required effort or thought. He ate alone, silently, and sometimes found himself talking to the empty room as if it were a companion. The echoes of his voice were comforting in their familiarity. He had one regular visitor, an old friend who lived across town. They met once a week at a small cafe, sat at the same table, and talked about the news, the weather, or the occasional story from their youth. There was a rhythm to these visits that suited him. They offered human contact in a controlled, predictable way. He enjoyed the friendship, though he would never admit it out loud. It was enough to know that someone knew he existed and remembered him as more than just a neighbor or an odd man behind faded shutters. Evenings were the hardest. The world outside slowed, and he was left with his thoughts. Memories surfaced uninvited, some painful, others bittersweet. He would sit by the fire, a book in hand, though his eyes often stared past the pages, lost in reflection. The hours stretched long and quiet, and he found himself talking to the shadows on the wall, recounting stories of days long past. Sometimes he would laugh softly, other times he would sigh. It was a solitude he had chosen, yet it weighed on him in ways he did not always acknowledge. Despite his withdrawal, he had an unspoken curiosity about the world. He watched people from a distance, studied their interactions, and wondered about the connections he had avoided. There was a fascination in the way people laughed, argued, and loved. It was messy, unpredictable, and entirely human. He had seen love and loss in history books, in photographs, in letters, but living it was something different. Something he had denied himself for so long, yet the curiosity lingered, a quiet reminder that life could still hold surprises, even for someone who had lived decades in careful isolation. His life, while disciplined and orderly, was not without small joys. A bird singing outside his window could lift his mood for hours. The scent of fresh bread from the bakery down the street made him pause and remember childhood mornings. A particular combination of sunlight and shadow in his living room could make him smile, appreciating the simple beauty of the moment. These small things reminded him that life, even in solitude, could be meaningful. He had learned to accept his own company, to find comfort in routine, and to live without the chaos of relationships. It was a skill born of necessity, hardened by time and refined through decades of quiet reflection. Yet beneath the surface there remained a spark of longing, a tiny ember that had not been extinguished. It was a faint hope that perhaps one day something or someone might enter his life and change it in ways he had not imagined. But for now he kept that hope carefully contained, a secret he did not share with anyone, not even himself. This was the world he lived in, a world of quiet streets, old houses, and carefully managed routines. He was a man who had chosen solitude, who had built a life around discipline and observation, who had buried his emotions deep enough to survive decades without personal connection. And yet the story had only just begun. For life has a way of entering the quietest corners when it is least expected. In the coming days something would happen, someone would arrive, and the careful balance he had maintained for so long would begin to shift. But for now he remained in his home, behind his shutters, observing the world with a cautious eye, ready to continue his life as he always had, untouched and undisturbed. Little did he know that the rhythms he had relied upon, the safety he had built, and the solitude he had treasured were about to be challenged in ways he could never have anticipated. A new presence in the neighborhood would soon stir emotions he had long suppressed, awaken memories he had carefully tucked away, and lead him toward a life that was fuller, messier, and more human than he had allowed himself to imagine for decades. And in that quiet anticipation, the first threads of a new story began to weave themselves into the tapestry of his life. Life on the quiet street went on as usual, with neighbors greeting each other, children laughing, and the distant hum of traffic filling the background. But something had changed in the rhythm of the elderly man's world. It began one morning when a moving truck pulled up across the street. Boxes were stacked carefully, and the woman guiding the movers moved with purpose and calm. She was unlike anyone he had seen before, bright-eyed, lively, and approachable in a way that immediately drew attention. He noticed her from his porch as he sipped his tea, an instinctive curiosity stirring inside him that he hadn't felt in decades. Days passed, and she worked on settling into her new home. He observed her quietly from the edge of his yard, making mental notes of the way she smiled, the way she carried herself, and how she seemed to engage with her surroundings. At first, it was just observation, safe, distant, and unthreatening. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more. But as the days turned into a week, he found himself looking forward to these small glimpses of her life. The spark he had kept hidden for so long flickered, tentative yet undeniable. One morning she noticed him sitting on his porch, as he often did. She waved, not expecting a response, but he hesitated, then gave a small nod. It was a simple gesture, but it meant more than either of them could explain. The next day, she came out with a cup of coffee and approached him cautiously. He was surprised, not used to direct engagement, but he accepted the cup with a quiet smile. Words were minimal at first. Good morning, a comment about the weather. But it was a start. Conversation, even in its simplest form, was a new experience for him. They began a pattern of small interactions. She would wave or speak a few words. When she saw him, and over time, he began to respond in kind. He noticed the way her presence made the world feel warmer, less rigid, and he could not deny the impact it had on his day. The walls he had carefully constructed around his heart were being chipped away, not by force, but by consistent kindness and patience. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet powerful. He felt something he had forgotten, the gentle pull of human connection. She had a way of making even ordinary moments feel significant. When they spoke, she asked questions about his books, his walks, and even the garden he tended so carefully. Her curiosity was genuine, not intrusive, and it encouraged him to open up in ways he had avoided for years. He found himself telling her small stories, fragments of his life, and memories he had kept hidden. The act of speaking these truths felt risky and exciting. There was a vulnerability in it that scared him, but also a strange sense of relief. He was not used to sharing, yet he discovered he wanted to. One afternoon they both ended up in the park. He sat on his usual bench, Kane resting beside him when she approached, carrying a small picnic basket. She asked if she could join him, and after a brief hesitation, he nodded. They sat together in the sun, the air filled with the sounds of children playing and birds chirping. She unpacked sandwiches and tea, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of normalcy and companionship. The conversation flowed effortlessly. They talked about books, the beauty of the changing seasons, and the small joys of life. He was amazed at how natural it felt to be with someone again, to engage without fear or expectation. As weeks passed, their bond deepened. He began to anticipate her presence, her words, and the subtle warmth she brought into his life. He found himself adjusting his routine, allowing time for their interactions, and even taking small detours on his walks to meet her at the park. It was a slow but steady transformation. He no longer felt the same rigid distance from the world. There was a quiet excitement in knowing that he could connect, care, and be cared for without losing himself. He noticed her kindness in countless small ways. She would leave notes or little gifts on his porch, simple gestures that communicated thoughtfulness without intrusion. Sometimes it was a freshly baked cookie, other times a book she thought he would enjoy. These acts of care felt profound to him, not because they were grand, but because they were intentional and consistent. He realized that human connection was not always about dramatic declarations or gestures. It could be simple, consistent, and deeply meaningful. There were moments of tension too. Old fears surfaced. Fear of vulnerability, fear of loss, fear of breaking the patterns that had protected him for so long. Some days he found himself retreating, hesitant to engage, worried that opening his heart could bring pain. Yet she never pushed, never demanded. Her patience was a gentle lesson, teaching him that trust could be rebuilt slowly, without force. He began to understand that relationships required effort, but the effort was not something to fear. It was something to cherish. One rainy afternoon, he found himself waiting at the corner of the street, umbrella in hand, hoping to catch sight of her before she disappeared into her home. When she appeared, he felt a rush of gratitude and affection that took him by surprise. They shared a quiet moment under the rain, talking about the clouds, the smell of wet earth, and the small beauty in ordinary days. He realized that he was No longer observing life from a distance, he was participating. And in that participation, he discovered the joy of shared experience, the kind that had eluded him for decades. She shared her own stories, her own vulnerabilities, creating a space where he felt safe to reveal more of himself. He learned about her past, her challenges, and her dreams. And in return, he shared his own carefully guarded memories. There was a rhythm to these exchanges, a trust that grew stronger with each conversation. He found himself laughing again, a sound that felt strange, yet liberating. Humor, he realized, was a bridge between hearts, connecting people across time and experience. One evening, as they sat on his porch watching the sunset, she reached out and touched his hand lightly. He froze, not from discomfort, but from shock at the unfamiliar warmth. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried a weight he had not felt in decades. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he allowed himself to truly see her, not just as a neighbor, but as someone who had become important in his life. The spark that had been dormant for so long flared to life, illuminating feelings he had long denied. It was a turning point, a silent acknowledgement that his heart was no longer confined by the walls of solitude. From that day, their relationship continued to grow in depth and trust. They shared meals, walks, and quiet evenings, each interaction strengthening the bond that had begun with simple gestures and cautious conversations. He began to plan small surprises for her, acts of care that mirrored the thoughtfulness she had shown him. Their connection was a dance of patience, respect, and affection, unfolding naturally without hurry or expectation. He discovered that his life, once confined to rigid routines and solitary habits, had become richer and more vibrant. The presence of someone who understood, respected, and cared for him transformed ordinary moments into experiences of meaning and joy. He found himself more engaged with the world, noticing details he had long ignored, appreciating the fleeting beauty of each day and feeling a sense of fulfillment that he had thought impossible. Yet he remained aware of his own limits. He understood that the past could not be erased, that the decades of isolation had shaped him in ways that required care and patience. He did not rush, did not force intimacy beyond what felt comfortable, but he allowed himself to be present in a way he had avoided for years. He realized that trust and connection were built gradually, through shared experiences, consistent effort, and mutual respect. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, he began to imagine a future that included her in a meaningful way. The thought of shared mornings, conversations, and quiet companionship became a source of hope and inspiration. He understood that life could still surprise, that love and connection were not bound by age or past experience, and that the heart, even after decades of solitude, could open again. Through these simple human interactions, the man who had once claimed he hadn't touched a woman since 1760 discovered the profound truth of life. Connection is not measured by time or history, but by presence, care, and shared experience. He learned that it was never too late to embrace companionship, to allow warmth into one's life, and to participate fully in the human experience. Each day brought new lessons, new joys, and new moments that enriched his life in ways he had long thought impossible. By the end of this period, their bond was unmistakable. It was no longer tentative, no longer confined to polite gestures or cautious conversations. It had grown into something steady, meaningful, and deeply human. The elderly man, once isolated and withdrawn, had begun to reclaim a part of life he had denied himself for decades. The rhythm of his days had shifted, the walls around his heart had softened, and the quiet hope that had lingered beneath the surface had become a tangible, living reality. In the presence of someone who cared, who listened, and who shared her life, he found not only companionship but also a renewed sense of purpose, joy, and the enduring power of human connection. As the days passed, their friendship deepened in ways neither of them had anticipated. They shared stories of their lives, sometimes serious, sometimes filled with humor, and the elderly man found himself laughing more than he had in decades. He told her about the books he loved, the walks he took, and the small routines that shaped his world. She listened intently, never interrupting, always curious, always patient. Her presence made him feel valued, heard, and understood, which was a feeling he had long forgotten. It was a slow, steady unfolding of trust, and he cherished it more than words could express. One afternoon they sat in the park, sharing a small picnic she had prepared. The sun was warm, the birds sang softly, and the world felt peaceful. He told her about his childhood, the friends he had lost, and the experiences that had made him who he was. She shared her own memories, her challenges, and the moments that had shaped her life. Their conversation was not rushed. It was a gentle exchange of thoughts and emotions, a dance of understanding and empathy. For the first time in years, he felt truly connected to another human being in a way that was honest and unguarded. He began to notice subtle changes in himself. His days felt lighter, his steps less hesitant, and his thoughts less confined by the walls he had built around his heart. He looked forward to seeing her, to hearing her voice, to sharing a quiet moment together. The anticipation was both thrilling and comforting. It reminded him that life, even after decades of solitude, could still offer joy, companionship, and the warmth of human connection. One rainy evening, she knocked on his door, umbrella in hand. He invited her in, and they settled in the living room with cups of tea. The rain tapped softly against the windows, creating a soothing backdrop for their conversation. They talked about the world, about memories, and about dreams that had long been put aside. In that quiet, intimate space, he felt a growing sense of safety, a reassurance that he could open up without fear. She encouraged him gently, asking questions and listening with genuine interest. He began to reveal parts of himself he had long kept hidden, fragments of vulnerability that had been buried beneath years of self-imposed isolation. Over time, he found himself sharing more personal stories, including regrets, hopes, and unspoken fears. She never judged, never dismissed, and never pressured him. Her patience was a balm to his soul, teaching him that connection was built on trust, respect, and mutual care. He realized that love and companionship were not about grand gestures or declarations, but about consistent presence, empathy, and understanding. Each day with her reinforced this truth, and he began to embrace it slowly, cautiously but wholeheartedly. They began to explore the world together in small ways. Short walks through the neighborhood, visits to the local market, and quiet afternoons in the park became shared rituals. He found himself observing the world differently, noticing details he had long ignored, appreciating the simple beauty of life, and feeling a renewed sense of wonder. She brought light into the corners of his life that had been dark for decades, and he responded by offering care, attention, and thoughtfulness in return. One evening, as they walked through the park, she noticed a small flower growing through a crack in the pavement. She bent down to admire it, and he found himself doing the same. It was a simple moment, but it carried profound meaning. They shared a quiet smile, an unspoken acknowledgement of the beauty in small things and the joy of experiencing them together. It was in these ordinary moments that he felt the extraordinary impact of companionship, the way it could transform even the most mundane experiences into something rich and memorable. Their bond continued to strengthen as they navigated life's small challenges together. He faced moments of doubt and fear, hesitant to let go of the solitude that had defined him for so long. She offered reassurance and support, never pushing, never forcing, but gently encouraging him to embrace trust and connection. He discovered that vulnerability was not a weakness but a strength, and that allowing himself to care and be cared for was a path to fulfillment he had long denied himself. They shared quiet evenings in his home, reading books aloud to each other, discussing ideas, and laughing at shared observations. The elderly man found joy in the simple act of being present, of engaging with another person in a meaningful way. He realized that human connection was not about dramatic displays or constant excitement, but about steady presence, shared experiences, and the comfort of mutual understanding. Each moment with her was a lesson in patience, empathy, and the quiet power of companionship. One afternoon, as they sat by the fire, she reached out and held his hand gently. He froze at first, the gesture unexpected yet deeply moving. It was a simple touch, but it carried a weight of emotion that he had not felt in decades. He looked into her eyes, and in that gaze he saw acceptance, care, and genuine affection. It was a turning point, a moment that marked the deepening of their bond and the awakening of feelings he had long suppressed. The warmth of her hand reminded him that connection was possible, even after years of solitude, and that the heart could open again, slowly but surely. As their relationship grew, He began to take small steps outside his comfort zone. He invited her to help in his garden, shared meals more regularly, and engaged in conversations that went beyond surface-level topics. He discovered that life could be richer and more fulfilling when shared, that joy multiplied when experienced with someone who truly cared. The routines that had once defined him became more flexible, more open to spontaneity, and more infused with the presence of another person who mattered deeply to him. She, too, found comfort and joy in his company. She appreciated his wisdom, his gentle humor, and the depth of his reflections. She admired his patience, his thoughtfulness, and the care he took in observing and understanding the world. Together, they created a space of mutual respect, trust, and warmth, where both could be themselves without fear of judgment or rejection. It was a partnership built on understanding, empathy, and the quiet power of human connection. Over time, he found himself anticipating her visits with a sense of excitement and gratitude. He looked forward to shared walks, conversations, and quiet evenings together. Each interaction strengthened the bond between them, reinforcing the truth that connection was not limited by age or past experiences, but by willingness, presence, and care. He realized that life could still offer joy, companionship, and love, even after decades of solitude, and that these gifts were worth embracing fully. They began to share dreams and plans for the future, small at first but growing in significance. Weekend outings, visits to local markets, and shared meals became traditions that both cherished. He discovered that life could be enriched by the presence of someone who understood him, cared for him, and shared in his experiences. The bond they had formed was not fleeting or superficial. It was a steady, enduring connection that brought meaning, warmth, and fulfillment to his days. As the months went by, he noticed subtle changes in himself. He laughed more freely, spoke more openly, and engaged with the world around him with renewed curiosity and appreciation. He realized that the presence of someone who cared had the power to transform not only his days but his perspective on life itself. He felt a growing sense of hope, joy, and possibility, recognizing that connection and companionship could bring richness and depth to a life once defined by solitude. One evening, as they watched the sunset from his porch, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. The woman beside him had become an integral part of his life, a presence that brought warmth, understanding, and joy. He reflected on the decades of solitude that had preceded this moment and marveled at the transformation that had taken place. Life had given him a second chance, an opportunity to embrace connection, care, and companionship in a way he had long thought impossible. He understood now that the heart could heal, grow, and open again. Even after years of withdrawal and isolation, the bond they shared was not built on grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but on steady presence, empathy, and the quiet power of human connection. He realized that life's true richness lay in shared experiences, in the care and understanding of another person, and in the courage to embrace vulnerability and trust. Through their growing relationship, he discovered that it was never too late to find companionship, to experience joy, and to allow love into one's life. The fears that had once held him back, of rejection, loss, and vulnerability, began to fade, replaced by the understanding that connection was worth the risk. Each day brought new opportunities for laughter, conversation, and shared moments, and he embraced them with a sense of wonder and gratitude. In the quiet of the evenings, they would sit together, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes sharing stories and reflections. These moments became a sanctuary, a place where both felt safe, valued, and understood. He realized that human connection was not about constant activity or excitement, but about presence, care, and the shared experience of being alive. The simple acts of listening, speaking, and being together created a bond that was both deep and enduring. As their relationship matured, he began to see life in a new light. The world outside his home felt more vibrant, more engaging, and more filled with possibility. He noticed details he had long ignored: the sound of birds, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery, the laughter of children playing in the street. These small joys, once taken for granted, now held profound meaning when experienced with someone who cared. He understood that life's richness was amplified when shared, and that the presence of another person could transform ordinary moments into something extraordinary. The elderly man had begun a journey of emotional awakening, guided by patience, kindness, and consistent care. He discovered that the heart could open again, that trust could be rebuilt, and that love could flourish even after decades of isolation. Time continued to flow in quiet, steady rhythms, but the elderly man's world had changed in ways he could no longer ignore. The woman had become a part of his days, a constant presence that brought warmth, laughter, and a sense of purpose he had thought lost forever. Their interactions had evolved beyond simple conversation and shared moments. They now included shared plans, small projects, and experiences that required trust, cooperation, and care. He found himself looking forward to her visits, her words, and the quiet companionship that had grown into something deeper and more meaningful. One morning, she arrived with a small basket of supplies for gardening. He had always tended his garden alone, carefully and methodically, but her enthusiasm and energy added a new dimension. They worked side by side, planting flowers, weeding the soil, and laughing at their clumsy attempts to coordinate. She spoke of the joy in nurturing life, of watching something grow from nothing, and he realized that her presence had given him a renewed appreciation for the small wonders of the world. He discovered that caring for something alongside someone else created a bond that was stronger than words could describe. During these shared tasks, he began to open up about deeper parts of his past. He spoke of regrets, moments of loss, and the mistakes he had made. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to speak honestly about emotions he had long buried. She listened without judgment, offering empathy and understanding, and in return she shared her own experiences. These exchanges were not easy. There were tears, moments of hesitation, and pauses where the weight of the past felt heavy. Yet through it all, they found strength in each other, discovering that vulnerability could be a bridge rather than a barrier. One afternoon, a small crisis tested the bond they had built. The woman faced a challenge in her personal life, something that shook her confidence and left her uncertain. She confided in him, revealing fears and doubts she had not shared with anyone else. He felt a surge of protectiveness and care, realizing that his feelings for her had grown deeper than he had admitted, even to himself. He offered support, guidance, and presence, sitting with her as she processed her emotions and helping her find clarity and calm. In that moment, he understood that love was not only about companionship and laughter, but also about being present during moments of struggle, offering steadiness, patience, and care. The crisis passed, leaving a strengthened bond between them. The experience had shown them both that trust, honesty, and mutual support were the foundations of a meaningful relationship. He realized that his previous life of isolation had been safe but shallow, and that true connection required risk, openness, and emotional courage. She too had seen his unwavering support, recognizing the depth of his care and the sincerity of his affection. Together they began to envision a future where challenges could be faced as partners, with understanding and empathy guiding their actions. Their shared experiences extended beyond the home and garden. They explored the neighborhood together, discovering small cafes, quiet parks, and local events that brought joy and novelty. Each outing was a chance to learn more about each other, to laugh, to share opinions, and to create memories that would anchor their connection. He noticed the way her presence made ordinary experiences feel vibrant and meaningful, and he began to savor these moments, fully present and engaged. Life, he realized, was not meant to be observed from a distance, but lived fully, with connection and care. Evenings became times of reflection and closeness. They would sit together, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing stories, and often simply enjoying each other's presence. The elderly man discovered that these quiet moments held a depth of meaning he had never experienced alone. He found joy in her laughter, comfort in her words, and a sense of peace in the shared rhythm of their lives. The intimacy they developed was not rushed or forced. It was a natural unfolding of trust, patience, and mutual respect. One evening, he invited her to join him in sorting through the letters he had kept for decades. They sat at the table, carefully untying ribbons and reading fragments of memories long past. Some letters were filled with joy, others with sorrow, and all of them carried pieces of his history he had rarely shared. She listened intently, asking gentle questions and offering empathy, and in doing so she became a bridge to his past, helping him reconcile memories with the life he was now building. It was a profoundly moving experience, one that strengthened their bond and allowed him to confront parts of himself he had long avoided. As their relationship deepened, He became more comfortable with physical expressions of care. Small touches, a hand on the shoulder, a comforting hug, or a playful nudge became natural parts of their interactions. Each gesture was a sign of trust, affection, and emotional presence. He had spent decades avoiding touch, claiming it unnecessary or dangerous, but now he discovered the simple power of physical connection. It was not about passion or romance alone, but about the human need for closeness, reassurance, and shared presence. They began to plan small adventures together, trips to nearby towns, visits to museums, and walks along scenic paths. Each experience was an opportunity to create new memories, to explore shared interests, and to deepen their understanding of each other. The elderly man found himself looking forward to these outings with excitement and anticipation, a feeling he had not experienced in decades. He marveled at the way life could surprise him, offering joy and connection when he had least expected it. Through these shared experiences, he also discovered the importance of patience, empathy, and understanding. There were moments of disagreement, times when misunderstandings arose, and instances when emotions ran high. Yet each challenge was met with communication, respect, and a willingness to understand the other's perspective. He realized that relationships required effort, but that the effort was a source of growth, fulfillment, and deep emotional reward. As weeks turned into months, their bond solidified into something steady and enduring. He found himself thinking about her during the day, anticipating her visits and feeling a sense of warmth and comfort even in her absence. She had become a part of his world, a presence that brought balance, joy, and meaning. The walls he had built around his heart were no longer barriers but protective memories that coexisted with newfound openness and vulnerability. He had learned that connection could be built gradually, with care, patience, and consistent presence. One chilly evening, as they sat by the fire with tea in hand, he reflected on the transformation that had taken place in his life. He thought about the years of solitude, the routines that had defined him, and the careful distance he had maintained from human connection. And he realized that each small interaction, each shared smile, each act of care had led him to a place of warmth, trust, and affection he had long believed impossible. She had become more than a companion. She was a presence that brought life, understanding, and joy into his days. He began to share more of himself, not just stories and memories, but hopes, dreams, and thoughts about the future. He discovered that planning and imagining life together was a source of excitement and fulfillment. They spoke of small goals, simple pleasures, and ways to continue building their shared life. The future, once uncertain and solitary, now felt open, promising, and filled with possibility. Their connection was no longer tentative. It had grown into a steady, dependable presence in both of their lives. He had learned to trust, to care, and to allow himself to be cared for in return. She had become a part of his daily existence, a presence that enriched his world in ways he had never imagined. Their bond was built on respect, empathy, and consistent care, creating a foundation that could withstand challenges and grow stronger over time. Through shared experiences, quiet moments, and consistent presence, the elderly man discovered the transformative power of human connection. He realized that life could still surprise, that love and companionship were not bound by age or past experiences, and that the heart could open again, even after decades of solitude. The bond he shared with the woman was a testament to resilience, patience, and the enduring capacity for joy, trust, and fulfillment. In the months that followed, they continued to explore, share, and grow together. Each day brought new opportunities for laughter, conversation, and meaningful connection. He discovered that life's richness lay not in grand gestures, but in steady presence, empathy, and the courage to embrace vulnerability. She became a source of strength, joy, and companionship, transforming his world into a place of warmth, connection, and hope. The elderly man reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had once believed that solitude was necessary, that human connection was too risky or complicated. Yet through patience, care, and consistent presence, he had discovered that connection was not only possible, but essential to a life of fulfillment. He had learned that the heart could heal, grow, and open again, and that joy could be found in shared experiences, mutual care, and the simple act of being present with another person. By the end of this period, their bond had reached a level of depth and stability that neither had expected. The elderly man, once isolated and cautious, had embraced trust, care, and connection. He had discovered the beauty of shared life, the warmth of human presence, and the profound joy of companionship. Life, once quiet and solitary, had become rich, vibrant, and meaningful, filled with experiences that brought laughter, comfort, and love. Their story was still unfolding, but the foundation had been laid for a life together, built on trust, empathy, and the enduring power of human connection. The years of quiet, careful living had prepared him for many things, but nothing had prepared him for the depth of connection he now experienced. The woman had become an inseparable part of his life, a presence that filled the spaces he had long thought empty and unreachable. He found himself awake before dawn, not out of obligation or habit but in anticipation of the day, knowing that it would be enriched by her company, her laughter, and the simple joy of shared moments. Life, which had once felt measured, controlled, and predictable, had become full of possibility, warmth, and discovery. Each morning they shared tea by the window, discussing the plans for the day and the small details of life. He had learned to savor these routines in ways he never had before, appreciating not only the predictability, but also the presence of someone he could truly trust and care for. Their conversations ranged from the trivial to the profound, from the weather and the books they were reading to reflections on life, memories, and dreams. Every word, every glance, and every gesture built layers of intimacy and understanding that strengthened their bond. They continued to explore life together, not with grand adventures but through small, meaningful acts. Walks in the park, trips to the local market, and shared meals became rituals that held profound significance. He found himself noticing details he had long ignored: the way sunlight filtered through the leaves, the laughter of children at play, the gentle rhythm of birdsong. In her presence, these ordinary moments became extraordinary, rich with meaning and joy. The world, once distant and observed from a careful distance, now felt alive, vibrant, and inviting. One day, as they tended the garden, he found himself laughing freely, a sound that had not escaped him in decades. She laughed alongside him, their voices mingling in the soft afternoon air. He realized that joy, like love, was something that could be nurtured, shared, and multiplied. He had spent much of his life avoiding vulnerability, yet here he was, fully present, fully alive, and fully connected. The garden, once a solitary retreat, had become a place of shared creation, care, and discovery. Evenings became times of reflection, conversation, and quiet intimacy. They would sit by the fire, sharing stories, reading aloud from books, or simply enjoying each other's company in comfortable silence. He found a sense of peace he had never known, a deep understanding that human connection, built on trust, empathy, and shared experience, could bring profound fulfillment. Her presence had transformed his home from a place of solitude into a sanctuary of warmth, understanding, and emotional richness. As their relationship grew, he began to confront the parts of himself he had long neglected or avoided. He spoke of regrets, missed opportunities, and the isolation he had chosen, and she listened with empathy and compassion. In turn, she shared her own experiences, fears, and aspirations, creating a space where honesty and vulnerability were met with understanding rather than judgment. These exchanges strengthened their bond, teaching him that emotional openness was not a threat, but a path to deeper connection and mutual trust. They celebrated small milestones together: the first blooms in the garden, a successful shared meal, a visit to a place they had never been before. Each event, no matter how modest, was imbued with significance because they experienced it together. He realized that life's richness was not in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in the steady accumulation of shared experiences, thoughtful actions, and meaningful presence. The depth of their bond was measured not in time alone, but in the quality and authenticity of the moments they shared. One afternoon, a quiet challenge tested the strength of their connection. A minor accident in the garden left her shaken and slightly hurt. He immediately rushed to her side, offering care, comfort, and reassurance. His instincts to protect, support, and nurture were awakened in ways he had not expected. The incident, though small, highlighted the depth of his commitment and affection. She, in turn, expressed her trust and reliance on him, reinforcing the mutual care and respect that had come to define their relationship. Through this experience, he understood that love was not only about companionship and joy, but also about presence and steadfast support in times of need. Their days became increasingly intertwined. Shared routines and rituals replaced the solitude he had once cherished, yet he found himself grateful rather than confined. He took pleasure in small acts of kindness, preparing a cup of tea for her, arranging fresh flowers, or leaving thoughtful notes that expressed appreciation and care. Each gesture, though simple, conveyed profound affection and reinforced the bond they had cultivated over time. He had learned that love was expressed as much in ordinary actions as in words or grand gestures. They began to dream together about the future, making plans that were simple but meaningful. Weekend trips, visits to local landmarks, and quiet evenings spent together formed a tapestry of shared life that brought both anticipation and satisfaction. He discovered that planning and imagining life with another person was not a burden, but a source of hope, joy, and motivation. The future, once uncertain and solitary, now held promise and excitement, colored by the presence of someone he deeply cared for and who reciprocated that care. He also discovered that their bond allowed him to reconnect with aspects of himself he had long neglected. Creativity, curiosity, and playfulness, once subdued by decades of caution and isolation, re-emerged. He found joy in trying new things, exploring new ideas, and engaging in shared experiences with her. Her encouragement, patience, and enthusiasm fostered growth and self-discovery, teaching him that life's potential did not diminish with age, but could be renewed through meaningful connection and shared experiences. Over time, their relationship evolved into a deeply rooted partnership. They became not only companions but collaborators in life, navigating daily routines, challenges, and joys together. They supported one another in ways both practical and emotional, finding satisfaction in shared successes and resilience in shared difficulties. The elderly man realized that true companionship was built not only on affection, but on mutual respect, trust, and the willingness to grow together. His life, once defined by careful isolation, had transformed into a rich tapestry of connection, care, and shared purpose. One serene evening, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. The sky glowed with warm colors and the world seemed hushed in reverence. He turned to her, feeling a profound sense of gratitude and affection. Words were unnecessary. The depth of their connection was felt in every glance, every touch, and every shared moment. He realized that he had never truly understood the meaning of presence, trust, and love until this very moment. The decades of solitude, while formative, had led him to a point where he could now fully embrace life, connection, and companionship. In the quiet intimacy of their shared life, he reflected on the transformation that had taken place. He had moved from cautious observation and isolation to openness, trust, and active participation in life. The woman had been the catalyst, but his own willingness to embrace vulnerability, patience, and trust had allowed the bond to flourish. He understood that life's richness was found not in avoidance of risk, but in the courage to open one's heart, to care, and to be cared for. They celebrated ordinary moments with extraordinary appreciation. Shared meals, laughter over minor mishaps, quiet evenings reading, and spontaneous conversations all became treasures in their daily lives. He discovered that love and companionship did not require perfection, only presence, empathy, and commitment. Each day was an opportunity to deepen understanding, share joy, and experience the fullness of life together. The elderly man had once believed that decades of solitude were necessary to protect himself from hurt, disappointment, and loss. Yet through consistent care, trust, and shared experience, he had learned that isolation was not safety but limitation. Life, he realized, offered richness, meaning, and joy when hearts were open to connection, when vulnerability was met with understanding, and when love was nurtured through presence, patience, and care. As time continued, their lives became inseparable. They supported one another through challenges, celebrated achievements together, and found comfort in the routine and unpredictability of daily life. Each shared experience reinforced the depth of their bond, creating a foundation of trust, empathy, and mutual care that could withstand time, circumstance, and change. The elderly man, once removed from the world and wary of connection, now understood that companionship was a source of strength, growth, and profound joy. In the culmination of their journey together, he recognized that the woman had not merely entered his life, she had transformed it. She had awakened parts of his heart and mind that had long lain dormant, taught him the value of trust and vulnerability, and shown him that love could bloom at any stage of life. Together they had built a life of shared experiences, laughter, care, and emotional richness. The man who had once claimed he had not touched a woman since 1760 had discovered that human connection, when nurtured with patience, empathy, and trust, could redefine life itself.